Okay guys, welcome back. Welcome to video C. Last day we were talking about the oral cavity, we were talking about the teeth. In this video we're going to start off talking about another part of the oral cavity, which is the saliva. Now, saliva is a mixture of secretions that are produced by your salivary glands, and for the most part, 99.5% of it's going to be water, okay? The other 0.5% is going to be made up of electrolytes like sodium chloride, bicarbonate. We're going to see buffers in there. We're going to see mucins, which are also known as glycoproteins, so proteins with sugar or monosaccharides associated with it. There's going to be antibodies there that will help an immune system. There'll be waste products, and for us, when we're talking about the digestive system, the interesting thing is going to be the presence of some enzymes, notably salivary amylase. Now, what does saliva do? Well, it's got a couple of important functions. First, it lubricates the mouth, so it keeps the mucous membranes in the mouth moist, which keeps them healthy. It's also going to moisten and lubricate the materials that we put in the mouth. For example, our food, it's going to mix up with our food, and it's going to take food that may be scratchy or brittle or hard, and it's going to make it a bit softer, which is going to be a bit easier on the tissues as we swallow and move through the digestive system. It's also a good place for us to dissolve chemicals, so chemicals need to dissolve in order to be sensed by our sense of taste, for example. So dissolve the chemicals, those dissolved chemicals can access the taste buds, and then we can do a preliminary analysis of our food based on our taste, like we mentioned last class. And another thing that saliva is going to do is it's going to begin the digestion of some complex carbohydrates and also some lipids. Now, the mouth has 3 pairs of salivary glands, and those glands are going to secrete the saliva that we just talked about. We have a set of glands called the parotid salivary glands. We also have the sublingual and the submandibular. Now, whenever you're talking about biological and you talk biologically important terms, and we're talking about different words, always a good idea to break them down. So if we look at this word here, sublingual, the prefix sub usually means below, under. Lingual is going to be our descriptor of the tongue. So sublingual would mean under the tongue. So if we look on the figure over here, you can see the sublingual salivary gland is right here. Now, the next word down here, submandibular, again, mandible is the bottom jaw. Sub means underneath, so our submandibular salivary gland is going to be right here. Now, the parotid, of course, doesn't have a descriptor on it, so we just need to remember where that is. And the parotid one is going to be right in front of or beside the ear. So those are the 3 pairs of salivary glands we have in our mouth. Now, here they are again. So we see our parotid, our submandibular, and our sublingual. And it's important to note at this point that the salivary glands are exocrine glands. So don't forget, an exocrine gland produces a product, and that product is transported via a duct to where it's going to have an effect. So in this case, the ducts are from each gland release the saliva directly in the mouth, where it's going to have an effect on our food. It's going to lubricate our food, moisten our mouth, and all of those other functions that we mentioned in the previous slide. Now let's start with the parotid salivary gland, and we're going to find it towards the back of the mouth, under or next to the adjacent to the ear, and this is going to secrete a type of saliva that has a large amount of salivary amylase in it. And that amylase, the saliva produced by that gland, is going to travel through the parotid duct, and it's going to empty into towards the back of the mouth. And you can see the parotid duct and the parotid salivary gland on the figure there to the right. The next gland is the sublingual salivary gland. So this is the one below the tongue, and this one produces a really watery mucus secretion. It's going to act as a buffer and a lubricant for food. If you think about sometimes when you're really hungry and you smell something and it causes your mouth to water, your mouth feels like there's water forming in it. It's probably going to come from this gland here, all right? It's going to be a thin mucus secretion. Other times, if you're feeling nauseous or ill and you think you might vomit, just before you vomit, this gland will secrete a lot of saliva into the mouth, because it'll help protect, since it's got those buffers, it'll help protect your teeth and the tissues of your mouth against the low stomach acid of the low pH of the vomit that's going to be coming up. So it has a small duct, and it's released into some tiny little ducts right underneath the bottom of the tongue. And then the third salivary gland is the submandibular gland, and so at the bottom of the mouth towards the back, and it's going to produce buffers, mucins, and also salivary amylase. So just behind the lower teeth, that's where we're going to find the submandibular duct. So all three of these glands are going to act to produce saliva. It will enter the mouth, and then the saliva can carry out those functions that we said were really quite important. Now, the parotid and the submandibular glands are going to secrete this enzyme called salivary amylase. And amylase is an enzyme that breaks down a starch, which is known as a quite complex carbohydrate. So if you take in a complex carbohydrate such as starch, as soon as you bite into it and it reacts with the saliva, we're going to have to start the beginning of chemical digestion. Okay? It's in the mouth, so we're also going to have physical digestion as well, but this will be the very start of our chemical digestion. And this enzyme will start to digest the starch immediately in your mouth, and then even after you swallow it, and it goes down into the stomach, it's still going to continue being active for about 1 or 2 hours before the enzyme becomes deactivated because of the change in pH. But it's also important to remember that the amount of digestion in the mouth, the amount of chemical digestion, is actually quite small. Right? We don't secrete a ton of enzymes, and we don't have the food in our mouth for a very long time, so we don't get a whole lot of chemical digestion. But it does begin, chemical digestion does begin in the mouth while we're chewing. So this is an interesting slide right here. This gives you a couple of bits of information. It's going to give you the time. So if we look here, we can see times, and we can see the pHs. So this is going to tell us what changes as we go through the digestive system. So far we've only been talking about the mouth. So when you're chewing your food, you rarely chew it for much more than a minute. And the pH in the mouth is somewhere around neutral, a little bit acidic, 6.5, a little bit basic, 7.5, but somewhere around neutral. And so the enzymes that are in our mouth, the salivary amylase, and there's another one called lingual lipase, those two are going to be most efficient in around that neutral pH range, although some of them are a little bit more resilient than others. So if you go down and you look at this right here, we're looking at the stomach. So food can spend around 4 hours in our stomach, and you can see the pH changes a lot in our stomach from 1.5 up to 6.5. There's a big range there. And then if we look at the small intestine, that's these two here, we can see that the food will stay through our small intestine for around maybe up to 6 hours, and the pH is going to go from acidic, 4.0, up to relatively basic, 8.5, and then the bulk of our digestion, in terms of time, is down here in our large intestine. We're going to see a pretty big range in pH, but we're going to see really, really long time for us to digest stuff down here, between 10 hours to several days. So this is an interesting figure for you guys to have a look at. Okay, so I alluded to this just now, but there's another gland on the tongue that will secrete one more enzyme into our oral cavity, and that's an enzyme called lingual lipase. Now, lingual, of course, is going to mean the same as before. It's talking about our tongue, and lipase is going to be an enzyme that will break down lipids or fats. So the lingual lipase will break down triglycerides into fatty acids and diglycerides, and this lingual lipase will work over a pretty large pH range, between 3 and 6. So that tells you that it will still work in the upper part of the stomach, like we talked about on the previous slide, but it probably won't be quite as efficient as we get further down into the stomach, where the pHs get much lower. Okay, so right behind our oral cavity, we have a structure that we call the pharynx. And the pharynx is a passageway for stuff to enter the body, and that includes solids, like our foods, the liquids that we drink, and air, the gases that we breathe in. So if we think of this area right here as our oral cavity, our pharynx is going to be the area right behind it, this area back here. Okay, and that's a lot of lines on one diagram, so I'll take those off. But we break up the pharynx into three sections. We get the nasopharynx, and the nasopharynx is going to be the opening to the nasal cavity where it enters the back of the throat. So generally what we think of is the stuff behind the soft palate and between the nose cavity. That's going to be, area right here is going to be our nasal pharynx. The next part is the oropharynx, and that's going to be the area from the bottom of the nasal pharynx to the top of the epiglottis, and the epiglottis is this structure right here. And then below that we're going to have the laryngopharynx, which is the area below the oropharynx and moving down into the esophagus. So food will normally pass through the oral cavity. It won't enter the nasopharynx. It'll pass through the oropharynx, pass through the laryngopharynx, and move into the esophagus. So that's the pathway that food will take once we swallow. Now, swallowing is also known as deglutition. Okay, so deglutition is the fancy word, the bigger word for swallowing. And swallowing has a couple of different stages, well, three stages actually. It has oral, pharyngeal, and esophageal transit. Now, transit just refers to movement. So the movement across the oral cavity, the buccal cavity, the movement across the pharyngeal cavity, and then the movement through the esophagus. So those are the three stages of swallowing or deglutition. The first one, movement through the buccal cavity, is voluntary, right? You guys know that you decide when you want to swallow. So you chew your food, you're happy with the size of the food, the feel in your mouth, and you decide to swallow. You make that decision, you swallow, and that's the first part. That's the oral transit, okay? That's how food passes through the oral cavity. Once you decide to swallow, after that, once food enters the pharynx and the esophagus, it's involuntary after that. So smooth muscles will take over, and it will pass food down into the esophagus and then into the stomach. So as we get the food in our mouth, we chew it up, we mix it with saliva, and we form a bolus. And a bolus is another word for lump, a mass. If we look down at the pictures, we'll be able to see the bolus is in the blue. And as we chew it up, our tongue will push the bolus to the back of the throat, and it'll enter the pharynx. Now, this is the oral transit. This is the part that we decide we're going to swallow. Once it gets into the pharynx, a couple of different things happen, but it's all involuntary. You don't have any control over it. Okay, so once we enter the pharyngeal stage, the bolus is passed through the oral cavity, and it needs to get into the esophagus. So a couple of different things happen. First of all, the uvula, which is a structure in the back of the throat, will swing closed, and that will shut off the nasopharynx. So that way it prevents any food from entering into the nasal cavity, so it won't interfere with your breathing. The second thing that's going to happen is we get a small structure here called the epiglottis, and the epiglottis is going to close, and that's going to block off the trachea. So that prevents the food from entering into the respiratory system. So that prevents food from entering your lungs. It saves you from any possible infection. It forces the food to go down into the to the esophagus, and that's the esophageal transit. Now, once it enters the esophagus, we get a series of smooth muscles that alternate. It forms a wave of contractions, and this is called peristalsis. And this peristaltic movement will continue as it moves, as the food moves through the rest of the digestive system. So basically, peristalsis involves the series of involuntary smooth muscle contractions that will push a bolus through the digestive system. It starts in the esophagus and it doesn't end until excretion.